Well, 63. That's how many families Karen Springs set out to visit in a road trip across America. And they weren't just any families. They were families who had adopted children. Take a look.
Karen Springs has worked with CBN's Orphans Promise for nearly 15 years in the Ukraine. After hosting numerous families and helping them through the adoption process, Karen has set out on a road trip to the U.S. to explore what happens after parents bring their adopted children home and real life begins.
Through this journey, my hope is to give voice to both the pain and the joy that is found in adoption.
In her book, Adoption Through the Rearview Mirror, Karen shares stories of heartache and hope, helping better prepare families for the road ahead.
Please welcome to the 700 Club, Karen Springs, author of Adoption Through the Rearview Mirror. Karen, it's so great to have you with us today.
Thanks.
You grew up in a family that had adopted. What was that like for you?
Oh, so my family didn't adopt, but I had relatives that had adopted, and when I moved to Ukraine, I got to walk through their adoption process with them.
So you've had so much experience. We talked about it with Orphans Promise and processing families in and out of Ukraine as they went to get their children. What was that experience like for you?
Well, I think part of my adoption journey or experiencing it was probably similar to your experience in that we can all walk in with a bit of rose-colored glasses and that we just think the answer is we need to place children in families. And when I first moved to Ukraine in 2004 and visited an orphanage for the first time, that was my first conviction, is just how do we get these kids out of orphanages and into families? But as the years went by, I quickly became aware that it wasn't so simple as that, as a kid getting healed just by being in a family. And that was part of the reason why I wanted to take this journey, is I was becoming more aware of the challenges that families were facing. And so I wanted to take this journey, interview the families, and find out what they wish they'd known and what they'd learned through the adoption process.
So as you took this trip across country, what did you discover about adoption in the rearview mirror?
Yes. Well, you know, it's funny. There's a Soren Kierkegaard quote that says, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. And I didn't know about that quote before I began on my journey, but I will say that my journey was the essence of that understanding, is that, yes, we walk forward, but we learn from our rear view perspective. And, you know, families had, by the time I met them, they'd removed their rose-colored glasses. They had realized that, that adoption wasn't a walk in the park, that it was full of challenges, also that God was with them in those challenges. And so really, it was fun and such a unique experience to sit down and let them share the most vulnerable parts of their story, and also share the ways that God was working through those parts of their story. So I think that everyone learned, you know, hindsight is 20/20, but there's a reason why also that God doesn't show us everything before we walk forward.
Absolutely. And yet you want people through your book to see something that maybe they hadn't seen before. You talked about the rose-colored glasses. You know, I think a lot of times we think love will be enough, belonging will be enough, but in fact, the journey is more complex. Talk about the complexity of that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that with anything, you know, you go in with one perspective, and then I think people go into adoption knowing that it will be hard. But there was this sentiment of many families, is that they didn't know which version of hard that it would be until they were in it themselves. And I think, you know, it's understanding that kids who have grown up in institutions or in any difficult circumstances have experienced trauma to some extent, and it's learning about the effects that has on the brain and how to help children. And I think that parents that I saw be the most successful were the ones that were learning to walk through that journey with their kids and recognizing that they didn't have all the answers, and so that they needed to find the right resources to become equipped to help their children.
Did you find you had such experience with people in the beginning stage of their adoption? Were there things as you processed all of this that surprised you?
I think that maybe one of the biggest surprises was some of the grief that families experienced. I think, we can often sell adoption as this bright and happy thing, and neglect to share the hard side. And I think one of those harder sides is the grief that can happen. And that can be for the child, that can be for the parents. And I think parents maybe knew that their child would experience grief, but they didn't experience their own grief of just the loss of how their family was before they adopted, or all the changes that came. And that was an aspect that they really just hadn't prepared for yet.
Yeah. And yet, I know that you are a huge proponent for adoption. So you haven't changed your mind about that, have you?
No, I don't think that I've changed my mind. And I know that, Terry, you and I have talked about it before, that not everyone is called to adopt. And I think it's recognizing that we're all called to do something, but that doesn't mean that it's the actual call of adoption for every single family. And so I think I just believe that families need to walk in with their eyes wide open, prepared, ready to do whatever it takes to get their child help. But yes, it's definitely not for everybody, and it's not for the faint of heart.
It's not. I want to say, if you are considering adoption, Karen's book is wonderful. It's called Adoption Through the Rearview Mirror. It's available where books are sold, and you'll hear from many families who have experienced this and been honest enough to share their stories.
Your Orphans Promise has done a great deal, to help children, but what she says is right. It's not easy to bring somebody into another family. You found that trauma.